Hi everyone, welcome to our Mark's Gospel series, and today to the first part of chapter 14. We're getting pretty near to the crucifixion now, and we're seeing that Jesus divides people. Some are entirely hostile to him, like the religious leaders who want to kill him. Others, however, show remarkable devotion to him. And that's the way this chapter begins. We learn in verse 1 that the religious leaders are trying to find a way to kill Jesus, and are pretty much stumped until Judas offers to betray Jesus in verse 10. In between, we learn about a woman who came to Jesus and broke an expensive jar of perfume and anointed Jesus with it. The disciples saw it as a dreadful waste, but Jesus welcomed it as signifying his coming death, an anointing that would signify his death. This perfume was probably a family heirloom. Symbolically, this woman therefore was committing her very best to Jesus and in some ways committing her future to Jesus. It was an expression of absolute devotion, the very opposite of what's happening at either end of the story with the actions of the religious leaders and of Judas. Judas was trying to use Jesus to further his own agenda. This woman was entirely content to treasure Jesus for who he was. You see, properly seeing who Jesus is should lead us to devote our all to him. We then get Mark's account of the Lord's Supper on the night before Jesus died. Jesus gathers with his disciples to eat a traditional Passover meal. And during the meal, he warns that one of them will betray him, and they just cannot comprehend that such a thing could possibly happen. Now, the Passover meal by this stage had been celebrated for way more than 1,000 years, and it involved a number of symbolic elements and actions that look back to the great deliverance of God's people from Egypt all those years ago. At the climax of the plagues that were visited on Egypt, God's people were saved the dreadful judgment of the death of the firstborn, as they, in obedience to God, killed a lamb and put its blood on the doorposts and lintels, meaning that the angel passed over their homes and deliverance came. Now, these disciples with Jesus would have been able to recite every element of the Passover ceremony in their sleep. But amazingly, Jesus takes this ancient practice and he changes it. He inserts himself into the story. You see, when the bread is broken, he says, "This is my body." With the wine, "This is my blood of the covenant which is poured out for many." It really is an astonishing act. And yet by doing this, Jesus is saying that this ancient event actually foreshadowed him. He would be the lamb slain for the deliverance of his people. Under his blood, there would be safety and life. As Jesus and the disciples go from there to the Mount of Olives, he warns them that they will all fall away. They all protest, of course. They protest their loyalty, and Peter does so especially loudly. But of course, he and the others will all fall away. We do tend, don't we, to so easily overestimate ourselves. Our strength is less than we think. Our devotion is weaker than we think. And human effort is ultimately insufficient. Only Jesus can really be trusted. The last section we're going to look at today is the story of what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane. The disciples fail him. Jesus is alone. And what Jesus prays is highly significant. "Take this cup from me." The cup in the Old Testament is frequently the container for the wrath of God. Jesus knows that the cross means taking the wrath of God against human sin. And naturally, Jesus would want to avoid that, but he perfectly submits to God's will. Now, this is important because it indicates that the cross actually does something. It's not just an extravagant gesture. It actually achieves something. It achieves the payment for the price of sin. So for all who shelter in it, for all who trust in not in themselves, but in what Jesus done, their sin is paid for. There are so many messages coming to us in these verses, but I think together they are underlining the futility of human strength and human effort, and the absolute sufficiency of what Jesus is able to do for us. We're going to continue to see that. So read the rest of chapter 14, and I'll see you tomorrow.